Welcome everybody, and I want to thank you for the invitation that we had come here to present our work to you today, and hopefully that it'll help you into your work and progress this work on. And I think that although that we're presenting from a uniquely Coast Salish tribal viewpoint there, we think it's work that can be adopted nationwide, not only by the tribes, but by the scientific community and anyone who's for the environment who wants to protect it and see change. So again, my name is Larry Campbell. I'm from this, my Indian name is Wanasea. I'm from the Swinomish Indian tribal community. Quite often you'll hear us today talk about the Coast Salish and the Salish Sea, but at the same time, just remember that I'm just talking for Swinomish. I can't talk for the other tribes. But again, this is work we're doing here today. The Swinomish Indian tribal community, we're about 75 miles north of Seattle. We're between Mount Vernon and Anacortes. And we occupy, we're a sovereign nation that occupy an area of 7,000 acres. You'll see Lacona there. Most of you probably know about Lacona. It's a nationally known tourist trap. So you'll see most of our villages is over there on the other side of it, but we have a lot of woodlands and up at the north area off Highway 20, a lot of our economic development. So you'll see that probably 90% of our border, federally recognized Indian, is surrounded by water. So you see, climate change is going to be a very, very important topic for the tribes as we go forward. And a lot of the tribes, you'll hear the tribes talking all the time about we're place-based, we're our home. We're always talking about our homelands. So we're extremely dedicated to our homelands. And I'd say that the Swinomish Indian tribal community today is very rich because we not only have salt water, but we have fresh water too, because we're right off the mouth of the Skagit River. And so those are our use and custom areas, and that we occupy those areas, and we spend a lot of effort to protect those areas because the basic makeup of our people is being fishermen and making our living from the natural world. So again, that the Swinomish Indian tribal community today is, we have 900-year-old members. As a tribe, there's 29 tribes in the state of Washington at this point in time, and we're kind of a small tribe as tribe goes, but we feel that we're national leaders and work in protecting our environment. We've been working for quite some time on health and well-being model, and we're saying, what is health? What is health from a tribal point of view? And when you look at tribal people across this nation, that we're land-based people, we're from our homeland. And I guess whatever happens to the earth is going to happen to us. That we're going to see if our earth is harmed in a lot of ways, that it's going to affect us as a people. And again, through various court decisions from 1974 that allowed us to go back to do the stuff that we did for thousands of years, is, like I say, chasing the salmon. So we're basically who we are. We're the most happiest when we're chasing the salmon, when we're chasing the crab and the clams, and all these things that we consider our traditional way of making our living, but also our traditional foods. So these traditional foods are very important to our well-being as we go forward today. I looked at it, this started out as a discussion probably 15 years with Jamie Donatudo, saying that watching one of our elders eat mussels, and she was also throwing down a whole bunch of Benadryl. And I asked her why she was doing that, why she was eating that if the food was going to poison her body, why was she eating it? Because she said it feeds the spirit. So when you got a land-based people who the foods come from the environment, that come from there, and they become very important to us. I didn't realize that until I was about 50. And then I realize how important those foods are to me. Now I can't get enough of them. But again, health from a tribal point of view, it's not individual health. It's not a husband and wife and 1.7 children, but it's a tribal community, tribal members into it. When you look at Swinomish, the old people tell us that if we talk long enough, we can find out how all 900 of us are related. Trying to find a wife or a girlfriend out of that thing is a cultivative our existence in tribal communities. I had to go to Canada and I had to go to Southern Oregon to find a wife. So. But again, we're trying to find a way to define health from a tribal point of view. And the models that we tried to put together is going to be quite different than you will find in your world. But we're also trying to find ways to give our elected leadership the tools that they need to show that there's a need, that there's a definite need and there's definite changes that is happening and that we need to make changes. We're also trying to develop this model that is not only be used by Swinomish, but all the tribes potentially could use it in the state of Washington and across the nation as a model in which to evaluate their own health, and well-being. Now, the anthropologists have told us you need to document your history before it goes away. We said no, we don't want to do that because we also don't want to destroy the relationship between the old people and the young people. But at the same time, we need to give our leadership enough ammunition to go to the state legislators, to go to Governor Inslee, go to Washington, D.C., and to show that there's a definite need and we can do that. And we also recognize the fact that we need to use science as an accepted law of the day. If you look at science across this nation, it's almost a religion. People believe in science so much that this is the avenue that the tribes have in order to able to warn the people and to try to get action as we go forward on this. So we feel as we go through with this project, it's not only a tribal project, but we feel that there's people out there in other communities, if they would take this model and to use it, that they would be able to put their surveys in a different manner to show that there's a human need and not just a financial need. So at this point, we'll turn it over to Eric Grossman, who is with the United States Coastal Geologic Service and one of our scientists.
Did you want to?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay, these are the categories that we, when we put our survey together, that the categories that we developed over time. Natural resource survey, because our wealth comes from the national world. The cultural use, because our culture is based around a hunting and gathering society yet. And the education, and not so much the public school system, but again, the wisdom that can come from the old people that can be shared with the young people. And the community connections and making sure that we have a community that is put together and that every part of our community is found useful. So that when you get old, you're not useless anymore, that you're not cast aside. One of my coworkers, he's as gray-headed as I am, and when we turned 50, he started making old jokes. And I says, hell, I don't even get valuable in this community until you're about 70. But the self-determination gets back to our treaty rights, the treaties that we signed in 1855. Again, that gives us a legal standing that the state of Washington and the nation has to come and consult with us on all of these projects that has a potential health effect on our people. And this other one here, we're looking at calm mind, emotional security. That's still not a very accurate thing that we're trying to get to, but then as we continue to further refine this, because this is a work in progress. That we'll share that with you at a later date. Mostly what we're trying to get there is the spirituality, because our spirituality comes from the land. We're people that are very close to the land, because that's where our wealth and that's where our instructions come to living in this world in a proper way. So again, thank you.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you everyone here for being so patient all 2 days. My name is Eric Grossman. I'm a coastal and marine geologist. I mostly work on sediment transport through our river deltas and nearshore environments, and then how nearshore processes affect our coastal environments. And I came to the Northwest to jump on the bus because I believed in this community, and I think that's actually what Larry and Swinomish are talking about with this emotional security. It's knowing you're part of a community and you're kind of hopeful and moving forward with well-being. And the part that I played here is beginning to examine how these coastal systems are going to change and influence biological and cultural resources. And we've done this in a number of ways. We have an amazing, complex coastal environment here. And we've put together a framework for studying a few of these things. Climate change impact pathways that you can see moving through this series of stressors and drivers of change, relating down to the bottom here in terms of some of those Indigenous health indicators. Today, we're just going to talk about those two blue bubbles up there, how we think sea level rise and waves are going to be interacting on this coast to influence shellfish in particular, and how shoreline armoring begins to play into sort of long-term viability of that shellfish. And that's the second reason I've moved up to Washington to participate here, is I really revere a lot of the knowledge that our Indigenous peoples have, and there's so much to learn from them. Not to mention that you all have to go to a traditional clam bake and understand what this is all about. So, sea level rise and waves. We know that from a number of studies, and we expect a lot more energy with rising water levels. Tribaldi's report that you probably have seen describes how along most of our west coast, the 100-year storm surge event is going to be turning into a 10-year and a 1-year event with just a couple feet of water level rise. And we also have some local data that shows there's some really important variability in winds that drive waves. When you look at this coastline here, this is the sort of traditional primary area for harvesting some of the tasty species of clams that Swinomish likes. These are butter clams and little neck clams. And so today I'm just going to talk about a small project that is phase 1, which is a vulnerability assessment to sort of guide us what part of this work do we really want to invest a lot more money in to do those process-based studies in a phase 2. So evaluate the likely impacts of this climate change scenarios. And this was done by synthesizing a number of information sets in GIS and adopting some sea level rise scenarios to intersect those coastal habitat traits. So we borrowed a number of the different scenarios from the IPCC and the National Academy's recent report that are shown there in the plot. We've evaluated a number of them, and today I'm just going to show you one example of a high-risk scenario. It's the 129 centimeters scenario from the National Academy's report. It's kind of in the higher range of likelihoods, but we think it's pretty justified for a number of reasons. In particular, we seem to be following the highest projected change of all of those sea level rise scenarios globally, and we think there's a lot of potential here as well. When it comes to the habitat traits, the most interesting part is the topography. These very interesting topography here I'll show you in a minute, and the intersection of clams, the substrate that supports those clams, how waves will change that substrate, harvest area, how we can actually access these environments, and shoreline armoring. And the whole story is really this. It's just, in this particular area, it's this interesting, lack of laser pointer, complex topography here. We have a And just an interesting happenstance that there's a nice low tide terrace in this area where the clams exist and that provide a lot of area to access the shellfish. That's quickly going to be inundated as you see sea level sort of jump up on that coast. Relative to a steep coast that you wouldn't expect so much change in area. And so we've synthesized a lot of the existing data. We know where the substrates are that these shellfish prefer. We also know where the shellfish are today. These are done by 13 years of data collection across the system. And if we assume a couple of those bathtub sort of models of rising sea level and inundating that low tide terrace, by 2100 you can see that red area is the zone left, sort of above that mean low water zone where folks can come down and harvest in the summer, and the intersection up above where that shellfish bound is. It migrates landward where it can in this model, but not in front of those blue lines, which is where the shoreline armoring is. So if we make the assumption that folks are going to want to keep the shoreline armoring and protect their properties, which I think we safe bet in this case, you can see the narrowest portions of these future bands happens to be right in front of those seawalls. So in total, there's a loss of about 27% of sort of shellfish harvest area and their growing area potential. And most of it's sort of along those seawalls, which line about 30% of the shoreline. So this becomes an interesting sort of discussion for Swinomish and state managers. If we want to protect the ability for beaches to migrate for shellfish, we may want to revisit seawalls and armoring permitting. Now, that was sort of a simple model. Waves, of course, influence this, and the shoreline can adjust. But this is just a nice summary of what we've observed around the world. Unarmored beaches typically can migrate landward, whereas down in the bottom you'll see the effects. These walls fasten the upper beach. No more sediment can be sort of produced and moved to the bottom shore face. And we almost always see an increase in wave energy as all this reflection off the walls is created. The scouring of the bed, which leaves a lot more coarser material that a lot of these shellfish don't really appreciate. And you also get sometimes a lot of extra turbidity, which isn't good for a lot of shellfish. So all indications are, even though it's a bathtub model, for a vulnerability assessment, these trends are common. They're not that conducive to shellfish. We also have evidence from this site how waves and the shore has evolved in the recent past. Zooming into this area where that seawall was, now colored in red. Two transects, one across the seawall and one south where there hasn't been a seawall. And after 13 to 14 years, you see the same kind of thing here as we have around the world, where much coarser substrates, steeper, narrower beach in front of the seawall, as opposed to the sandy mixed system that shellfish like, where there's no seawall. So same kind of system here. So where we're going now is, and Larry didn't really talk to it, but Jamie took some of this information as a scenario, asked the tribal members through a few workshops how they feel about their 6 community health indicators that we talked about, sort of with this in mind. And it becomes a priority to examine this because shellfish is so important. So what we're going to do next is, with a new source of funding from the EPA STAR grant, develop a more process-based model to look at how the shoreline will essentially evolve dynamically with that change in sea level and waves and sediments coming down the Skagit River. We have a tool already called Coastal Resilience for 6 of the largest Puget Sound deltas. We've done a lot of work in all of them and produced these types of future scenarios of flooding up and over levee systems and dike complexes for a number of reasons: habitat, ecosystem restoration, and infrastructure planning. But what we'll do now is add to this. We have a module that looks at wave energy up a number of these different cross-shore transects. If you go to the website at the Nature Conservancy, you'll see Coastal Resilience and Coastal Defense. The Coastal Defense shows the results of wave modeling up and over all of these transects over a number of different scenarios, and you can interact with it. And just for example, what we've done and will now do for the Swinomish coast is look at transects like the middle one here, colored in yellow, that stretch across these coastal zones. And this is what we're talking about. It's similar to a couple of posters that we saw downstairs. They're fabulous. Using some of this sort of typical nearshore wave transformation algorithms of Thornton and Guza and Stockton, bring the total water level up over our present topography and future topography to explore how wave energy is transmitted across the shore towards some of our valued shorelines. And so this just shows you at a low tide moving through to a high tide for a 2-meter wave, 4-second period coming up these tidal flats. You know, it's all of these wave exposures across this entire complex influence things like seagrasses, shellfish, invertebrates, and so we'll be pulling these out, particularly for the higher water levels like these that reach the shore and essentially have a lot of impact. So we'll be pulling out things like run-up, inundation, shear stress, and wave heights along the shore up through the whole Swinomish Reservation and projecting a few of the outputs of some of our regional climate models. So that's what you have. And I thank you for coming. No. Yeah. I wasn't prepared to speak of those last 3 anyways, so jumping to this.
If anyone has any questions for Larry or Eric, please raise your hand and we'll take questions now. We have time. No questions? Raise your hand. Oh, we got one here.
How does your tribe perceive of climate change generally? Can you speak to that at all?
Well, our elected leadership and our tribal members, I guess that when you look at the last presidential administration that we had in place, it was still, they were still arguing if it was a reality or not. We skipped that step and we said it's a reality, it's happening. And so we started developing plans to mitigate the effects of climate change. We didn't get into that argument because that as observers of nature, we already saw the effects of it. How would you say it? Talking with elders from all over the state here, they were saying a lot of the traditional foods and medicines that we had access to in the past, when they went to gather them, they were no longer there. So they wasn't sure why that was happening, but then they know that something was changing. So again, we used the government and then we used the science there to try to figure out why that is happening.
Any other questions? Oh, we have one here.
Hi, I really liked and found interesting your list of community-based Indigenous health indicators, and I noticed that they really take a strengths-based approach to positive things in the community that indicate health. And I'm wondering if you also looked at resistance or resilience to detrimental factors, like you list natural resources security for traditional foods and things like that. What about resistance to outside unhealthy foods or something like that? Would you consider that a community health indicator, and where would it fit?
Well, I really think that when we look at the absence of our traditional foods, that what do we replace it with? McDonald's. We replace it with a lot of processed foods. Then you look at the overabundance of diabetes, obesity, heart problems, and all these other health factors that come in from the absence of eating. I guess that you find out that after a while that when your body craves something, you know, it's telling you that you need this, that you're deficient in that vitamin or something like that. So we also know that it provides a certain amount of cultural health also, you know. So it's You have to go with those feelings, and we're trying to find a way to document those.
We have one more.
There's been a strong effort the last several years to decade nationally to look at a lot of sea level rise and wave impacts. Not so much inside some of these estuaries that we're talking about with the Salish Sea and maybe the Columbia River Basin, San Francisco Bay. So there's just the last couple of years or so delving into that. These are sort of fetch limited systems, but we see, significant movement of large cobbles on the beach despite large ocean swell. And so we're learning about that.
Eric, I think you mentioned that following this study that you had gone out and worked with tribal members and asked them, about these indicators, and I'm curious how that information gets communicated, either in that tool or something else. I mean, what kind of raises the hair on the back of my neck a little bit is the idea that you're boiling this down to one number on each indicator, and saying this is kind of the monolithic representation of how all these people feel about this. And I'm just curious if you can reflect the diversity, if there is a kind of wide divergence of how this made different tribal members feel about the report, or if it is something that makes sense to just say, here's the average, and display it with all these other things about here's what sea level rise is, or what wave energy is, or anything like that.
When we're doing these surveys, you have to realize that we've got a small condensed community here, and we're not doing it nationwide, statewide, or county-wide. But it's some of these questions and some of these surveys take in fact that these things are important to all of us as tribal people. So there's not arguing between what is important. Is this more important than that's important? And you look at some of the results that we put, they're very general in mind, because and again, that we want to give our leadership a look at the trends rather than any sort of specific complaint. I think that our elected leadership knows all of these things, and they fight for all these things, but again, at the same time, that sometimes we need supporting evidence to back that up, and those needs from the tribal community. I don't know if that answers your question, but close as I can come to it right now.
There was general consensus on a number of the six indicators. We didn't go into specifics about the drivers as much. That was your question. There was definitely consensus on preserving the ability to have location down at the beach, around the clam bank, for example, and everything that goes around that. So, strong concern.
Thanks to both of those very interesting talks.